in particular, a concept that makes up most of the QR assignment. So I'll probably do this again on Wednesday. Keep tabs on what all is left to be done. We've got a week from now, unit exam 3. So just like I've mentioned before, module 6 kind of tends to lull us into like this content that we're like, okay, this stuff is pretty relatively easy. But remember that module 5 is also going to be on unit exam 3. A bigger chunk of it is going to be module 5. This, even though it's an easier module, that still means there's a homework due at the end of the module, the perusal guided reading due as well. And then things after the last day of class. The way this course is designed, there are still some assignments. One of them is what we'll focus on today. It's really the only kind of brain power you need besides the final. That's the QR assignment, QR assignment 3. These other two, the peer evaluation and the reflection for exam 3, are really just completion based. If you put some thought into your answers, you get the full credit for the reflection assignment. And remember, the peer evaluation, I'm not grading most of it. Most of it is how y'all are grading each other, the other members of the group. So you want to, that one is in part kind of out of my hands how y'all grade that, but it's based on how much y'all have contributed and whatnot for each of these group assignments and activities throughout the semester. So yeah, we'll focus on QR assignment 3 related content today. And besides this, there shouldn't be any more assignments. So this is everything that's left. So even if you don't do the weeks at a glance regularly, if you look at this slide and kind of scratch things out, once you've scratched everything out, you've done everything you can for this class, at least regarding what's left. So yeah, QR assignment 3 focuses on this community level ecology. So what we call community ecology. Can anyone remind us what a community refers to? Yeah, Carlita.
All the different species in a particular area?
Yeah, exactly. So if we kind of think of, these different levels of ecology, we can kind of basically build it up from the level of an individual. So organismal ecology would be something like how an individual interacts with their environment. So here is our individual, give them a random name like Leroy, and any of that. And so when we're talking about how individuals interact with an environment, we refer to this level as the organismal level of ecology. From there, we can think of how individuals of the same type, so other Leroys, interact with one another as well. So when we're talking about all the population of Leroys, then we call this the population level of analysis, population ecology. But there are other organisms we can be dealing with as well. So, we can be dealing with other species, other types of individuals, living organisms. That could be fish they live with. Doesn't always have to be animals, right? It can be interactions between animals and plants, just among plants in general. It can be even beyond that, bacterial species that we interact. I'll draw it according to the 3 shapes you might want to be relating to the final. The broad-shaped one, which is referred to as what kind of shape? Bacillus. Yeah, bacillus. I don't even know how to yeah, bacillus, circular bacteria. Yeah, coccus or cocci, streptococcus, staphylococcus are all coccus type bacteria, or the easiest one. Yeah, the one that looks like a spiral, spiralized, spirelli. So it can be, when we're talking about interactions between species, we refer to this as the community ecology level, which is what we'll focus on today. But it does go beyond this. So this is essentially the level of all living things. And even though we tend to think of it as animals interacting with one another, it really does comprise of anything living. That includes bacteria. What you'll see in the QR assignment is, references to bacterial communities as well. The levels of ecology kind of grow beyond that, and we'll kind of focus on that in our last day on Wednesday. But for today, we'll kind of just focus on the way species interact and how communities are in general developed, how communities are established. And so a lot of this depends on how different species interact with one another. First of all, one of these kind of population level measures that you want to be familiar with, species don't just interact with other species, but members of species interact with each other as well. And one kind of large scale effect of the way individuals within a species interact, the way a population interacts, affects what we call their distribution. And the three you want to be most familiar with are these clumped, uniform, and random distribution. And they each kind of tell us something about the way resources are kind of spread out in an environment. So what we might expect, for example, from a uniform distribution is that resources are kind of readily available throughout that whole area. And so individuals will just kind of distance themselves accordingly. You can think of, a neighborhood, at the level of a street, right? Houses are kind of evenly spaced out within a neighborhood. Within a given street, resources tend to be pretty similar. Each individual, neighborhoods are often kind of categorized according to socioeconomic status, with members of the same street kind of being in that same SES group. And so resources from one house to the next, they might differ, but not all that much. When we kind of spread this out, kind of zoom out, we might see more of a clumped distribution, right? Individuals living kind of in fancier, larger homes compared to individuals living in apartment complexes where more individuals are, it's kind of more densely packed. And species kind of distribute themselves that way too. Even beyond the level of just SES, humans at the global scale have a very clumped distribution. Cities tend to be along the coast or along some sort of river, and that reflects our access to resources, right? Even though we have many ways of kind of delivering, the vast majority of goods and resources are still transported by sea, right? So port cities tend to be the most abundant types of cities. So, relative to, a desert, which could be an expansive area like the Sahara or the Gobi Desert, not a lot of people live there because there aren't that many resources there. And so if we looked at a global scale, we might say the human population follows a sort of clumped distribution, where the resources are going to be is where people tend to kind of clump together. And then if there's a place that's hard to get to, or where resources aren't as readily available, you're not going to see as many people. The same thing happens with animals as well. And not just animals, plants, all species tend to aggregate where the resources are most abundant. And then lastly is a sort of random distribution. This one is, really sort of a cop-out. A random distribution implies that there is no rhyme or reason to the distribution. But in reality, a random distribution should kind of be more correctly categorized as an unknown distribution. the species probably are distributed in some way. We just don't know according to what just yet. You can only measure so many things, and if it doesn't, correlate with, say for these patches of flowering plants, say you measure, nitrogen content in the soil, temperature at the soil, water availability, and it doesn't clump according to either of those three things you measured, we call it a random distribution. Doesn't mean it's not actually correlated with something, just probably something we didn't measure. And so, yeah, the way species kind of interact with each other might dictate how they spread themselves within a population. But all of this proximity between individuals or between different species ultimately leads to interactions between those species. And so your textbook kind of describes all these interactions as interactions between species. But one important thing to note is that this can also describe members within a species as well. So competition, for example, that one might be kind of easy to imagine. Competition could mean two or more species competing for the same resource, but competition is part of human everyday life as well. Even though we kind of tend to think of competition in humans as like an economic thing, it also is biological. That economic resource is important. And so competition is this only negative interaction. The reason for this, like I said last week, is if you think of species A and B interacting, fighting for the same resource, for both of those species, they'd be better off if the other species didn't exist. So relative to that scenario, they're both at a net negative because without the other species present, they would have gotten all the resources. The rest of these are relatively obvious, I think, to us at this point, kind of driven these points home: predation, herbivory, parasitism, mutualism we can kind of think of. The only two that aren't as obvious might be commensalism. And this one that we really don't talk about, facilitation. Honestly, you're not really going to see that on the exam. But it's essentially, a species has positive effects on other species without an effect on them. It's really just the flip side of commensalism. So commensalism, remember that example I gave? Can anyone tell me which animals those were? What's that? Yeah. The cattle and the cattle egret, right? The cattle egret will eat flies that kind of hover to the cattle's poop. And so benefit for the cattle egret, nothing for the cattle. Well, you could flip that around and just say the cattle produce poop at no cost. They have to poop anyway, and a cattle egret benefits. That's just the flip side of facilitation. It's just which perspective are you looking at? Commensalistic or facilitative interaction. We can skip this for now. One example where we've kind of seen competition at the very beginning of this course is going all the way back to the Galapagos finches, Darwin's finches. It's in particular seen in these two species. We didn't really focus on the species names when we were watching that Darwin finch video, but one of the species was this G. fortis. And sometimes they kind of exist on their own island, and sometimes they co-occur with another species, G. fuliginosa. And what we see, and that G. fuliginosa also lives on its own island as well. So we can think of these three islands: one where you only see G. fuliginosa, one where you only see G. fortis, and then one where we call it symmetry, living together on the same island. It's actually two islands, Santa Maria and San Cristobal, but in both of them, the two species co-occur. And what you see is when they live by themselves, they actually overlap in about how big their beaks get. And so we see that in these bottom two graphs here. So when they're raised by themselves, they'll both develop relatively similar sized beaks, about 10 millimeters wide. But when you raise them in the same population, now they have to compete for the same food that they're actually being selected for in these islands. So the reason they have a beak average of about 10 millimeters in both of these islands is because they're eating the same fruits. So what happens when you put two species that primarily feed off of the same fruit, they have to fight for that optimal size fruit. And what you get is this, this phenomenon called character displacement. So because they're both fighting for the same resource, you actually get selection to select against this competition. So what happens is one species ends up kind of focusing on slightly larger fruits. The other population tends to focus on slightly smaller fruits. And so on that island, this species, even though it's the same as the one on this island, they have slightly smaller beaks. And then with the G. fortis, on these islands where there's competition, they have slightly larger beaks because they have to settle for different sized fruits than they would otherwise prefer. So just an example of how competition can result in. So the what we'll kind of spend the rest of today on now is kind of mathematically summing up species interactions within a community. So how a community is comprised, what species are found within a community, how many species are there, what is the abundance of each species, and then how to measure a term that we hear all the time, but you know, if you were to define it, might not be too easy to do, and that's species diversity, or what we more commonly hear in the media, biodiversity. So how do we actually give a number to biodiversity? That's going to be the goal of today. So the two kind of fundamental features of community structure are species diversity and feeding relationships. So how individuals kind of get their nutrients. What are the differences between these three? So on the last exam and in the final, and especially in the QR assignment, you're going to want to be familiar with these three concepts: diversity, richness, abundance. Two of them are extremely easy. The other one kind of looks scary at first, but if you have a calculator, which you'll be able to have, you should use that. So let's just kind of walk through this with an example, but first kind of define each of these. So when we're talking about diversity, that's kind of a more complicated. It's describing, using a number, the total variety of organisms that make up a and when you measure species diversity, you can kind of focus it however you want. Realistically, it's hard to say what are all the species in a community, right? Even if we just look at what is the community in this room, it seems really easy, right? We're all humans here. But we all are outnumbered by at least 10 to 100 to 1 by bacteria, a bunch of different species of bacteria. So if we wanted to get a full sense of the community here, we'd have to take into account the bacteria, the cuties that are on the table, any other food that we have, right? Those come from living organisms, unless it's from the vending machines here, which there's nothing natural. But so the community can be, you know, almost inconceivable to measure in a given area, right? So let alone this room, if you think about an entire pond or ocean environment, it's often unrealistic. And so you tend to kind of focus, you know, instead of just saying, hey, what are all the species in this area? You might say, you know, what are all the trees? Just focus on tree species. So that's going to be the hardest one that we'll spend the most time on. The other two, extremely easy. Species richness is the easiest one. It's just counting the number of different species in the community. You'll see just how easy this is. The relative abundance is the proportion each species represents of all the individuals in the community. So what that means is say there are 5 species that you're interested in. For species 1, you say how many individuals of species 1 are there, divide that by the total number of individuals across the 5 species. That's the relative abundance. And so let's kind of work through that then. Looking at community 1 and 2. Just looking at these 2 pictures, can anyone kind of get at, let's first look at species richness. So what is the species richness for community 1? Just looking at, the plants that you're seeing drawn. Can we put a measure to this? Species richness.
Divided equally.
Yeah. So specifically, the species richness is how many species are there. In community 1, there's 4. Community 2, there's 4 also, right? Species richness is the easiest one to kind of get. It's just how many are there, how many species. You don't have to count the number of trees, just the number of things that look different. The relative abundance is already calculated for us. And you can, these images are in your textbook, but you can count them and show, do the math yourself. But essentially here, there are 20 trees. One of them is this species C. So 1/20 is 5%. The same goes for species B. There's only one of this cypress tree. And so 1/20, 5%. They both have the same relative abundance because there's 1 in 20 total. This one has twice as many. There are 2. 2/20 is 0.1, which is 10%. And then lastly, in community 2, the vast majority, 16 out of the 20 are this species A tree. If you look at community 1, you'll see that there are 5, regardless of the species you're looking at, there's 5 in each. So 5/20 for all of them is 25%. That's all there is to the relative abundance. So species richness is literally counting how many different things are there. The relative abundance is just counting proportions. And then the Shannon diversity is the next easiest. It's the negative sum of the product between the natural logarithm of the relative abundance of each species added up. So very simple, right? So we'll kind of walk through this for the rest of today. But before we do that, are we at least clear on the concepts up until this point? I want to kind of pause for questions. Good. All right. Good. Okay. Yeah. So the way these slides are made, it just kind of throws the equation at you. But we'll kind of walk through this a little bit more slowly and more intentionally than instead of just kind of showing the equation here. But why do we want to do this? Because biodiversity, even though it tends to be a nice kind of catchphrase, we all know biodiversity is good, but it's harder to say why do we care, about this random dragonfly species living in this random creek that I've never been to. Well, biodiversity has kind of real effects on the way an area is going to respond to the times where we mess up, right? Where we cause disturbances, whether it is caused by us or by some natural in and of itself. So one kind of real effect is that more diverse communities are better able to withstand these perturbations, these disturbances or environmental stresses. So, if you kind of have an oil spill in a given area, it's much more likely to rebound if there's a healthy diversity of species there. This kind of healthy diversity essentially means that there are what we call niches, niches that may or may not be impacted. This is actually really similar to why genetic diversity in a population is. I don't know if you remember way back kind of earlier in the semester when I talked about how bananas, this has also happened with papayas, but I think the example I gave was bananas almost went extinct from us, kind of in the mid 20th century. Part of the reason for that is, one nice thing about bananas is you don't have to bite through any seeds. Part of that is due to artificial selection. Farmers have selected for kind of less and less annoying seeds with each generation. That's why when you kind of do a cross section of a banana, you just see kind of these 3 gray dots in the middle. Those seeds are essentially largely non-viable at this point. They've been selected for so much to be less and less useful. So because of this, one of the ways bananas tend to be propagated is through a process called grafting, where you literally will take a branch from one banana, put it on a trunk, and it'll grow a new banana tree. But they'll be genetically almost identical. So what happens is when you have a big population of bananas that are all genetically identical, what happens if a disease comes that wipes out kind of a gene that banana has? It kind of selects for bananas with a certain combination of genes. Well, if one banana is screwed in that population, they almost all are. Same thing applies to an ecological community. So if one species makes up most of the community, if it's going to be impacted by a disturbance, then there goes the whole ecosystem. And so that's why kind of diversity tends to be, or more diverse communities tend to be able to withstand those effects. If that species now only makes up 1/10 of the whole community, then if it gets wiped out, you've still got 90% of the species around. The kind of more important point is that biodiversity can also make you a more efficient Pokemon trainer. And so that's what we're going to kind of do today before we kind of move forward with activities. We've all been out in the wild. We want to be the best, catch as many Pokemon as we can, but we're limited on Pokeballs, right? So everyday occurrence. So that's the case here with our uncopyrighted protagonist, Flash Ketchup. He wants to be the best trainer, and so just like we all know, he has to catch them all. I have an underline, kind of the most important point here is to be the best trainer, you've got to be the smartest, but also most efficient trainer. So Flash Ketchup is left with this decision. Should he go to one of these two, what he's been told are bio hotspots? And what's that? The dangerous ones? Yeah, well, we'll see. So Viridian Forest or Cerulean Cave. So we're going to take a look at both of these and try and figure out where Flash should primarily go. So first of all, we have Viridian Forest. I don't know how to minimize this thing. I wish I could. Oh, I guess I just did that. So his first option, Viridian Forest. And when we look at the Pokemon that are around in Viridian Forest, we essentially have mostly these 4 species. And what you're seeing is their relative abundances in the population. So essentially for every 2 Pikachu that you might find, you're probably going to encounter about 4 Caterpie, 4 Weedle, just as many 2 Pidgeys. And then option B is Cerulean Cave here. Here, there's a lot more species here. That you've got a bunch of Ekans, a bunch of Bellsprouts, and then a smattering of a bunch of other species: Zubat, Sandshrew, Otter, Paris, Venonat, Geodude. And so the question is, if you are Flash Ketchup, where are you going to try and become the best trainer? Let's kind of do this by show of hands. I don't want to do the eye clicker because some people legitimately can't be here today, so I don't want that to count against their participation. So let's just do show of hands here. Where should Flash start off? So we're going to assume Flash has an unlimited number of Pokeballs and time, and all the tools you might need to kind of see in the cave or in the dark. this. So show of hands if you would go to Viridian Forest first. Okay, so we've got a couple going for a Viridian Forest. Okay, with unlimited time, unlimited Pokeballs. How show of hands for Cerulean Cave? All right, yeah. So I mean, if you have an unlimited amount of time and resources, then yeah, Cerulean Cave might be the better option. It has what we would call a greater species richness. If you have all the time in the world, you can get up to 8 species in Cerulean Cave. Whereas in Viridian Forest, even if you spent an eternity there, you're only going to end up with 4 Pokemon. But that's not reality, right? Flash Ketchup only has enough bag space for a certain number of Pokeballs. And remember, to be the best trainer, he's got to be the smartest, most efficient trainer. So Flash only has, he doesn't have unlimited time. In fact, he only has a few minutes of time and a total of 10 Pokeballs. And so now, where should Flash start off? Assuming that Flash has 10 Pokeballs and not a lot of time. So you can't see well, so you just have to catch whatever pops up. So Viridian Forest, you see something shaking in the bushes and you got to throw the Pokeball at it. Cerulean Cave, you hear something walking, 10 feet away from you, so you throw the Pokeball. So you don't see the species you're about to catch until you've caught it. So now, which do you think would be the better option, Viridian Forest or Cerulean Cave? So hands up for Viridian Forest. Hands up for Cerulean Cave. Okay, so I've got a surprise for you. That's that I actually don't know the answer. I forgot from last semester, because the point is we're going to find out mathematically which is going to give you the best opportunity, kind of give you the greatest variety. And this is something that the Shannon Diversity Index, which is a big part of QR's degree, gives us. This kind of gives us a measure of how variable the community is. And so, yes, this means how well can it kind of withstand disturbances, how well can it function properly, but it can also mean how, which is kind of the best bang for your buck when you're trying to catch a wide variety of Pokemon. So we're going to kind of walk through this using the Shannon Diversity Index formula on these Pokemon themselves. And so I'm going to erase here. Hopefully that camera's following me. So when we're recording, you can see this, or when you're looking back at this, you can see this. But this is essentially the process we're going to use when you're calculating your own diversity indices for maybe not Pokemon, but maybe dung beetles or some other group of species. So the Shannon Diversity Index. Let's first kind of write out the formula here. H is our Shannon Diversity Index. And the way it works out is the larger the number is, the more diverse that community is. So it's a number that can really vary from essentially 0 to infinity, but it usually tends to be about 1 point something when we try to make it an easy math problem. So the larger it is, the more diverse it is. And it's this sort of complicated formula. But if we kind of look at what all the different parts of the formula are, it's really based off of one general measure. That's the relative abundance. And so the relative abundance, remember, that's just going to be, of a total population, how many of species, what is the abundance of species A relative to the whole number of individuals in that community, species B, species C, etc., until you've looked at all of the species. So the Shannon Diversity Index just depends on the relative abundances of each species. And so here we've got 4 species to work with in this whole community. We've got caterpies, weedles, pidgeys, and Pikachus. And so to correctly write this formula just for Viridian forest, we maybe don't want to write it in terms of just species A, B, C, and D, but the species we actually have. So we can make this, the relative abundance of caterpie times the natural log of the relative abundance of caterpie. Do the same for beetle. The same for pidgey. And lastly, the same for Pikachu. So we actually have our formula here. Once we fill all this in, we can calculate H on our calculator. But we got to find each of the relative abundance. Remember, the relative abundance should be relatively easy to do. So first, we're going to look at caterpies. How many caterpies are there? 4, yeah. And how many, what do we divide it by?
Total.
12, yeah. So 4 caterpies plus 4 weedles plus 2 pidgeys plus 2 Pikachus. 12. And so the relative abundance is about 0.3333. We do the same for weedles. And it just happens to be the exact same, right? There's 4 weedles over the 12 population. The population of 12, 0.3 repeating. Same for Pidgey. Now it's going to be half that, which is what? 0.16 repeating. 2 over 12. The same for Pikachu. Now, if you remember from way back in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, you remember there were some checks you could do to see if you're kind of good halfway there. So remember there was that equation P plus Q equals 1. So you could kind of go back to that, and if you solve for P and Q, you can make sure that they add up to 1. The same goes for relative abundance. So once you've calculated, you think you've calculated all the relative abundances, check your work. If you've calculated all the relative abundances correctly, these should all add up to 1. Which this does add up to. So this is our good check to say we've got our relative abundances down. Now all we have to do is just plug it all in. And admittedly, it's kind of a lot, but we can kind of work through it in steps. So we're going to put 0.3 times natural log of 0.3.
Extra. Oh, yeah.
The same for the weedle. 0.3 times the natural log of 0.3 repeated. And then put in the information for the Pidgey, which is 0.16 repeating times the natural log of 0.16 repeating. And it's the exact same for Pikachu, 0.16 repeating times the natural log. Natural log of 0.16 repeating. So if we do all this math, we can get our Shannon diversity index. Does anyone have a calculator handy? Yeah, so we can work on these one at a time. Really, to kind of make this more manageable, we really only needed the calculator 2 times. So that is finding out first the natural log of 0.33333, more or less, and multiplying that times 0.33333. What do you get more or less? Might have done this. Where that? Might be able to do it on my phone. Did anyone solve? Did anyone get? I got negative 0.36-ish. Something around there. Maybe not. Maybe I. Okay. Hold on. Wait. Did I? After a log of 0.3333 is negative 1.09-ish times 0.33333. Yeah, about negative 0.366. Did anyone else get that? Yeah, okay. All right, so luckily we don't have to do that again because we calculated it for Caterpie. We know it's going to be the exact same for Wheel. But we'll just round it to the nearest 100. So about negative 0.37 plus again negative 0.37. And now we're going to do the last calculation on this line, which is going to be for 0.16. 0.166666. The natural log of 0.16. Which is about negative 0.3-ish. Plus again, it's negative 0.3-ish for the Pikachu as well. Okay, so we've done that. You know, it's a little complicated, but it's just kind of repeating abundance times the natural log of the abundance. And we can add all of these up. So negative 0.37 plus again a negative 0.37 plus negative 0.3 plus a negative 0.3, which I got about negative 1.34. If you look at the formula, you'll see that all of that, we take the negative up. So that's why this negative is here. We like positive numbers in math. And so the negative, you should almost always end up with a negative number. And that's why the first negative is there. It's just to cancel out. And so for Viridian Forest, we have about 1.3. Right, so now what I want y'all to do in your groups is try, yeah, Leroy. You can join another table or tackle it yourself. So what I want y'all to do is do this for the much more complicated cerulean cave. Here, you know, there are more species to deal with, but if you calculate the relative abundance for Zubat, you know, you've got it for 5 other species. So shouldn't take too much time. But what I want y'all to do is try to get to solving for H for cerulean cave. I want to give y'all about 10 minutes to try and tackle this as a group. And then we'll get to our answer. But we have our answer already for Viridian Forest. 1.34. So if H ends up being more positive, greater than 1.34 for cerulean cave, then we know that it is indeed more biodiverse. So any questions on that? All right, then yeah, let's take the next 10 minutes or so to try and solve the cerulean cave puzzle. I'm going to try and calculate because I don't have my brain. Oh, I'm going to pause the recording. What types of what? Yeah, it's 2:15 to 4:15 December 9th. All right, so let's kind of look at this in baby steps in terms of those 3 kind of key words that have popped up here, which are species richness, relative abundance, and then lastly, the diversity. We've got to get the relative abundance to solve the diversity. And the species richness is going to tell us how many relative abundance count. So first of all, looking back at this first population in viridian forest, what would we say the species richness in viridian forest? Species richness. Yeah, 4. Yeah, so in viridian forest, yeah, no, yeah, you're jumping ahead, I think. So yeah, the species richness for cerulean cave would be 8. Yeah, so we've got the Ekans, bellsprout, zubat, sandshrew, oddish, Paris, venonat, geodude. 8 species total. And so this number tells us how many relative abundances do we need to calculate. So the relative abundances we already did for viridian forest. It looks like there's a lot more in cerulean cave, but you really only need to do the same number of calculations as you did for viridian forest because of the way the ratios are. So there's the same number of Ekans as there are bellsprout. There are 15 of both of those. And there's 1 of all the other species. So you really just have to calculate 2. Yeah, exactly. 2 numbers. 15 divided by 36. Yeah, and then 1 divided by 36, really. So the relative abundance, let's say for both Ekans and bellsprout, is going to both of those are going to be 15 divided by 36. How much is that?
You get 0.33.
Yeah, 36-ish. Okay. Did everyone get that? Wait, 15 over 36? No, that's not what I got.
50 divided by 36. 0.42.
Yeah, 0.42-ish.
Oh, yeah, 1.2.
Okay, there we go. All right. Yeah, so for both of them, it's going to be about 0.42. About. For all the others, zubat, sandshrew, oddish, Paris, venonat, geodude, going to be 1 over 36, which should come out to how much did y'all get? Yeah, 0.03 is what I got also. And so now we just need to do a longer version of that with all 8 species that we have. So we can write it all out, but we'll just do the calculation one time, just for the sake of space on it. So first let's calculate the relative abundance of either of these times natural log of that relative abundance, which is going to be 0.42. And what did anyone say what number they got for this?
0.36.
Yeah, negative 0.36-ish, that's what I got. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so for this, when we calculate this chunk of the equation, we get negative 0.36. And then what did y'all get for these species when it's 1 over 36? What does that relative abundance times natural log of relative abundance come out to? Negative 0.05. Okay, did everyone else get that? Negative 0.05. I got something a little different.
Negative
Oh, 0.105.
times 6.
So while we're just trying to do, yeah, it's confusing what I'm saying essentially. So, for regardless of which species this is, you should have gotten the same relative abundance, right? For each of those 0.03. So if we were to plug in 0.03 to this equation here, we should get a number. So 0.03 times the natural log of 0.03. Did anyone calculate that?
Negative 0.1.
Yeah, I got about negative 0.1. So yeah, this, even though it looks like a P, it's actually called rho. But rho, natural log of rho there would come out to about negative point. And so we've got now all of these pieces for cerulean K. All of those pieces by just these two calculations, negative 0.36 and negative 0.1. And so we can just add them all up and take the negative. So H equals negative. We're going to put all of this. So negative 0.36 for Ekins plus, again, negative 0.36, which is just the same as saying minus 0.36 for Bellsprout. And then for all the other species, negative 0.1 for Zubat, minus 0.1 for Sandshrew, minus 0.1 for Otter, minus 0.1 for Paris, minus 0.1 for Venonat, minus 0.1 for Geodude. So if you add all that up, did anyone get a number for that?
1.32.
1.32-ish. What? Yeah, I got around that. It's going to differ a little bit depending on if you round it to the nearest hundredth or thousandth or 10. It should be though at least somewhere near 1.3 something. So yeah, negative 1.32 thereabouts. So negative, it comes out to about 1.32. What was the H for Meridian Forest? 1.34. So just a little bit higher in Meridian Forest. And it, this is essentially the largest the difference will be. If you do it to the thousandth or to the millionth, it just gets closer and closer. So either way, though, it'll always come out regardless. So long as you do it consistently, always measuring to the hundredth or always measuring to the 10th or to the 1000th, you should always get Meridian Forest as having a larger H index, a larger Shannon diversity index than cerulean K. Just slightly though, right? They're pretty similar. They're just, a couple hundredths off in this case. But if, in this sport where the difference of a couple hundredths matter, if you're going to be the best, you're going to want to go to Meridian Forest. If you're limited on time and Pokeballs, you want to go to where the greatest diversity is. So, even if, at first glance, Cerulean Cave might have looked more attractive, right? It has more species there. The way they're distributed, you're actually better off capturing sometimes in the area where it looks like there are fewer species, because the distributions matter as well. So we can see that in the formula. If you look at what is in the Shannon Diversity Index, all it is some numbers based off of those relative abundances. So what this means is, let's think of ways you can make H bigger and bigger. Well, one way to keep making it bigger is to keep tacking on species, right? The more species you add on, even if it's 1/1000, it's going to add a little bit to the H measure in the end. So the more species you add, yes, the diversity gets bigger, but you'll also see that relative abundance matters as well, because each measure of that species, what matters is its relative abundance. So it has to be relatively what we call evenly distributed to be more diverse as well. So what we have is Meridian Forest. Yes, it has fewer species, but they're all at least more evenly spread out. There are a couple of species that dominate, but there's only 2 times as many Caterpie and Weedle as there are Pidgey and Pikachu. If we look in Cerulean Cave, yes, there are 8 species, but there's 15 times more Ekans than there are of any of these other species, 15 times more Bellsprout than any of these species as well. It's dominated by just 2 species, whereas this one, there are 4, but they're more evenly spread throughout the population. So diversity takes those two things into account. The number of species, yes, but the relative abundance is matter as well. You want an even spread to generate a more diverse community. So what we're going to do for the rest of today is work on a Shannon diversity based activity. We will I'll check in sort of the last 10 minutes of class, see how we're doing, and we'll either kind of wrap this up today or finish it on Wednesday. But take your time with this because if you can master this, you should be good for the majority of the QRs, which is, it'll ask a bunch of different questions, but the majority of the points come from calculating, making sure you're calculating the diversity, the richness, and those relative abundances. So any questions as I'm handing these out? All right. Yeah. Let's do it.
Oh.
Big attitude. It's recorded now.